joining us now, Ravi Aggarwal, Managing Editor of Foreign Policy. Thanks very much for being with us.
Permanently.
Just to the point, Ravi, of what we were discussing a little while back as you were joining us on, and the question is this: is there any qualitative difference for us here in India on what the Democrats bring to the table by way of foreign policy towards New Delhi, or the Republicans bring to the table?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one thing that's become very clear over the last decade or so is that India is one of the few issues in which there is bipartisan agreement in DC. So both Democrats and Republicans for many years now have seen India as a viable partner, as a country which could serve as a bulwark of sorts against China in the region. Whether the so-called Asia pivot worked out or not, it doesn't really matter, because India is still seen as a like-minded large democracy that would be good to grow ties with in every sense of that word. So I think that is a broader trend that has stayed in place both under a Trump administration and previously under Obama, and going back further as well. And you can expect that to stay in place no matter who actually wins this election. I think what you get, however, with a Biden presidency is a sense of certainty. In terms of just the international arena. I think you would see a return to multilateralism. I think you would see a return to a rules-based liberal international order. Whereas with Trump, many of us are often left guessing as to what he's going to do next. That sense of certainty, I think, is very important to build longer-term relationships.
Sorry, can I just ask you a bit of a layman type question? Very interested in what your answer would be. It's been amazing the relationship, the close warmth and relationship between our Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. And a lot of good things can come up. Is that true out of when leaders get on well together? If Biden wins, how much, I mean, that has to be, a relationship has to be built again, and whether it'll happen or not, we'll have to see. But could that be a bit of a setback for India?
I wouldn't necessarily see it as a setback. I think, sometimes those of us who watch the dynamics between leaders, we focus too much on chemistry. And yes, there was indeed real chemistry between Modi and Trump, but there was also chemistry between Modi and Obama, which you'll remember. There's no reason to suggest that you wouldn't see something similar were Biden to become president. But again, I come back to the underlying strength between the two sides' leaders at a step below, at the cabinet level. You've seen the 2+2 dialogue between the defense and foreign ministers from both sides, and then real diplomatic ties that have been built over the last decade that I think will endure no matter who becomes president. I think one thing to watch out for under a potential Biden presidency is an increased focus on an inclusive foreign policy here in the United States. And by that, I mean thinking more about what it means to have a foreign policy that includes discussions of women's rights, that includes discussions of atrocities against various communities. So under a Biden presidency, you may see, for example, the United States being much tougher on China on the Xinjiang issue. You may also see the United States taking a tougher line on Kashmir. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that's a rather thorny issue to bring up. But you remember our foreign minister didn't attend a meeting by a Democrat, was it Premila Jayapal? Because Kashmir, and maybe he was quite right not to attend. But it's just a signal that the Democrats are a little tougher on those aspects.
Well, I think Democrats have a firmer sense of values, of human rights. But not only that, it's one thing to have those values and norms at home. It's another thing to apply them to the rest of the world. I think Democrats are more willing to apply their domestic lens to the rest of the world, whereas Republicans, at least over the last 20-odd years, are seen as more transactional. So they're looking at it in terms of what's in it for me. And in that sense, no surprise, Trump has gotten on very nicely with many authoritarian leaders all over the world. I mean, there's Duterte, there's leaders all over the world in Europe as well. So that's something that may well change under a Biden administration. And indeed, it is something that I think many U.S. traditional allies in Europe would look out for. I think they, in many cases, yearn for a return to the era of a rules-based liberal international order led by the United States, one in which accountability is key, one in
Just
which
one clarification on that.
multilateral organizations like the UN have more standing than they've had under Trump.
Just a clarification on that. For the US now to talk about human rights after what's happened on the streets in their own country and the Black Lives Matter movement and the exposure of some of the racism that is inherent in that society, can they talk, do they have to cool off a bit? Because this last 6 months and this election should have, cooled them down a bit, lecturing to others, right?
Yeah, I think you may see, again, this is all hypothetical, but I think there is a recognition among American leaders that no matter what happens, they can't be as preachy as they once were to the rest of the world.
Right.
All of that said, I don't think that necessarily means the world doesn't need more sort of moral forces or guiding forces, and the U.S. can serve that role. But I'd I'd also like to point out on BLM, I wouldn't necessarily see it as something that didn't work out. I think, by and large, what was on display was large protests, mostly peaceful, by the way. That was an outpouring of support on a deep-rooted social injustice. Net, I think, months from now, years from now, we'll see that moment as one that was very important and progressive for American society, one that was long overdue.
Right.
And I think in that sense, America will see itself as having done something good and given it more moral standing rather than less. I think addressing one's problems and admitting to them will be seen as a strength rather than a weakness.
Right. Good point.